I'm Chris Steffen, and I am the Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator for Kansas Wildlife Parks and Tourism. My presentation today is going to focus on aquatic nuisance species in the state of Kansas, kind of a general overview of what they are, some specific information about how they're impacting Kansas, and some updates for 2012. So what are ANS? They are non-native species that impact our water bodies. So something that doesn't belong in the area that gets established either accidentally or intentionally, but that causes damage to that water body. Another way to think of it is simply biological pollution. And there are some federal legislation that guide management of these, and then within the state of Kansas, we have an ANS management plan approved by the governor. So how do these harmful invasive species spread? These nuisance species. So if someone moves water or plants or mud, vegetation between water bodies, they are potentially um, moving these harmful species. So some examples would be construction equipment, an excavator or something working on one water body moves to another. Um, a boat or a trailer is a more classic example. Someone goes fishing for a morning, doesn't clean or decontaminate their boat, and they move to another lake. They are potentially moving those nuisance species with them as well. So what happens when these nuisance species spread? In generally we see a disturbance of the natural balance. These native species didn't evolve with the nuisance species, so they can't cope with those new species. So we see declines in those native species due through predation or competition for resources, loss of habitat for native species, and all of which kind of leads to a general decline in recreation of those water bodies. As the species changes that lake, it changes usage there as well. And economic impacts are huge. Worldwide, about 5% of the global economy is impacted because of nuisance species. Some of the more typical extreme examples where economics comes into play is when nuisance species impact water lines or cooling lines for industry. Um, and also it can impact users of those as well. So these hidden costs are passed along in the form of higher electricity and water bills. And then for people fortunate enough to live on a lake, they can see those home values decline as the water body is impacted by invasive species. And so to bring it kind of a little more specific to home here, nationwide expenditures on zebra mussels are about $1 billion a year. For zebra mussels in the state of Kansas, we have limited data, but we do know water rights holders in the Neosho River Basin, it's about $1.5 million problem per year. And then a couple of our larger water treatment plants, initial setups to handle the zebra mussel infestations were in the millions of dollars and have recurring costs annually as well. So that's why it's critical with nuisance species that we detect them early. That gives us a better chance to manage them. The earlier we detect them, the less of an economic impact there is. So um, prevention, eradication, containment, all those things come early in the invasion. Those are cheaper than those multi-million or more expensive programs to deal with the long-term impacts of those species. So more specific example, kind of showing different states that tackled similar problems at different times in the invasion. Texas right now has a nuisance species plant called giant salvinia, and they initially didn't have resources to tackle this issue, and it got ahead of them. So now they're spending about $6 million a year to combat that species. Our neighbors to the east, Missouri, caught a hydrilla infestation when it covered about 30 small water bodies. and that's about a $250,000 a year program. In Iowa, they've proactively monitored many lakes for invasive vegetation species. And so when they do find something new, it's caught early and they're able to very effectively contain those problems or eradicate them altogether. So for them, 60 lakes, 35 of which are being treated, are relatively cheap because it's just small spot treatments that total about $30,000 a year in chemical. So for us here in Kansas, it's one of the emerging issues for our state, but one species of nuisance vegetation we're seeing spread are Phragmites. So the lesson here is prevention costs much less than management. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our couple of our priority species that you may or you probably have heard of. And just give some background on where we're at and the status of those species in Kansas. The first is the zebra mussel. It's this small clam-like species here you can see attached to the larger native mussel. These things get in a lake and they have what's called a byssal thread that allows them to attach to anything solid. So rocks, trees, dams, gates on the dam, anything solid these zebra mussels attach to up to about 6 inches deep. And they are native to Europe, traveled to the United States in the ballast water of ships, and then have been hitchhiking on boats and other water equipment through the eastern part of the country. So like I said, they attach to things solid. They have these byssal threads that allow them to do that. None of our native species have that ability. So these things sexually mature at a very small size. They breed multiple times per year potentially in Kansas. And so each one of these female mussels can put off about 1 million eggs per year. So they can very, very quickly infest a lake and become problematic. And so a lot of that problem is related to their attaching ability. So they get in pipes or intakes and clog those structures that are very costly to clean and maintain clean from those zebra mussels. Their filtering abilities can also contribute to the frequency or impact of harmful algal blooms. If you have zebra mussels in a lake, harmful algal blooms are more likely to occur. And so another impact we've seen here in the state of Kansas from this clog piping are water supply issues. In 2012, both Council Grove and Osage City lakes, Osage City faced water supply issues because zebra mussels had clogged infrastructure related to getting water from a lake to the users in the city. So where are we at? We've got 34 zebra mussel infested water bodies in the state now. In 2020, we did find 2 additional water bodies. They were both private, smaller kind of gated community type lakes. So, nothing large and public, but we do continue to see zebra mussels spread. And this is pretty typical. Since they entered the state in 2003, we've added about 2 lakes per year. The other priority species I want to talk about is the Asian carp. It's actually a combination term for silver and bighead carp, but we generally lump them together. These species are native here to China and Eastern Asia. They were brought here in the 70s to the state of Arkansas and escaped, and have since spread naturally through their ability to swim up rivers. So nationally, this is what the silver carp situation looks like. So they got into the Mississippi River system, traveled up the Missouri River system, and in the state of Kansas now live in the Missouri River and the Kansas River upstream as far as the Bowersock Dam. We also have a small population in the Neosho River. It's unknown how those fish got there, but they've been there for about 20 years, and we're just really focusing on that population as right now as well. So here, if you go out and visit a river with these Asian carp, you can see this. Boats spook them; they'll jump into the air. This is the Illinois River, which is kind of where most of the videos or pictures you may have seen come from. This is the original place in the country where they got very dense and thick. But we have that here now too. In 2011, there was a large spawning event, and since then, the Kansas River up to that Bowersock Dam in Lawrence is highly infested with these Asian carp as well. Impacts of these Asian carp are huge from a recreational standpoint as well as others, but the first is that jumping. It's a safety issue. They do and have harmed people. Some of these fish can weigh up to 60 pounds, and if you're driving a boat at 30 or 40 mile an hour, that's a serious safety risk. They also are filter feeders. They eat the bottom of the food chain out of a water body. So you can see this is a native paddlefish here on the top, nice, healthy, fat-looking fish. After having to compete with those Asian carp for food for several years, this native fish does not do well. And this is indicative of a lot of our native fish in those rivers. The Asian carp come in, they're prolific breeders, they're soon overwhelming the system and eating the bottom of the food chain out that the native fish need as well. And so what can happen in locations that have these Asian carp, there have been documented declines where the sport fish population is reduced by more than 90%. And for lakes that exist largely on the fish and the draw that is, economic opportunities disappear. Fishing tournaments go away. Value of houses around that water decline as well. And fishing in Kansas is big business. The latest estimates from 2011, freshwater fishing impact in Kansas is over $200 million. We can't afford to lose 90% of our game fish if those Asian carp begin spreading and establishing in our water bodies. So where are we with Asian carp? Like I said, the Kansas and Missouri rivers and streams directly attached to those all have Asian carp. We also have that small population in the Neosho River in southeast Kansas. But I'm happy to report that for 2020, we don't have any new locations, and that's largely due to the Bowersock Dam in Lawrence being able to hold back those fish at least at normal water flows. As you can see, there are a couple yellow dots on the Kansas River where a couple of fish did make it over that dam following the 1993 flood. Luckily, the 2019 flood didn't get that high. Some other species we're worried about are the black carp, another invasive carp species that eats native mussels. Phragmites is that invasive plant I talked about earlier. We're seeing this in western Kansas spread east. And then another big one is the Quagga Mussel. This is very similar to the zebra mussel, except for they have this ability to grow and habitate these areas of the lake that the zebra mussels can't. So the zebra mussels need a hard structure, the Quagga mussels do not. And so we have the state A&S program to prevent the spread and manage these A&S species. That's the program that I run, and typically in the past it's been funded through license sales to the tune of about $240,000 that are paid license fees by hunters and anglers. And so we've been pushing to increase. So what we do with these funds is work with other regional and national partners on A&S issues, but locally we do a lot of work on the ground in the state. So we inspect our bait shops for invasive species. We sample statewide for new zebra mussel populations, so we can find them and make everyone aware, and let those users know that their lake has zebra mussels, so that a water treatment plant, for example, could prepare for those impacts. We do a lot of other work within wildlife and parks to make sure that our agency is doing everything we can to make sure we're not contributing to the problem. So fish health testing, research, and we also do a lot of education outreach to just get the word out about aquatic nuisance species. And then in 2011, we're going to start doing some watercraft inspection and decontamination. And so where do we sit compared to our region and our neighboring states? Kansas traditionally has kind of been on the low end for funding aquatic nuisance species management. You know, states to the west have these much larger budgets and have been able to really aggressively prevent the spread of aquatic nuisance species. And mostly they're doing that through watercraft inspection and decontamination programs, which have been largely successful. As you can see on the map here, the red dots represent zebra or quagga mussel infestations. They've largely been kept out of the West. Those blue dots are the inspection stations. So um, those programs and the dollars behind those programs have really prevented the problem from spreading east to west in that part of the country. And here you can see just how many boats and where they come from those programs are catching. This information is for Colorado, but as you can see, they are catching zebra mussel boats from a lot of areas and preventing the infestation in their own state. One of the biggest developments for the ANS program in 2020 are progress in funds. There's been a lot of push by the federal government to get funds to the states, and we've been able to capitalize on that. In 2021, we'll be spending about 3 times what we traditionally have been on ANS management in the state. We also were able to get some funds in the budget by the Kansas Water Authority through the state water plan. We'll be able to use those for watercraft inspection decontamination. We had a grant from the Bureau of Reclamation for $172,000 to do watercraft inspection and decontamination. And then Fish and Wildlife Service granted us a little over $300,000 for Asian carp projects. So that small population in the Neosho River, we're going to be able to study them and look for ways to suppress or eradicate those. And we're going to be able to do some work on the Kansas River and hopefully prevent the upstream spread of those Asian carp as well. And then our traditional state management plan grant was increased from $44,000 to $93,000 by Fish and Wildlife Service also. So it all adds up to increasing the capacity of our program and ability to work on invasive species issues. But at this point, we're nearly entirely leveraged out or matched out. The state funds we have are being tied to federal funds, and we've done as much as we can at this point. And looking in the future, that's going to be an issue for us. Water Resources Development Act is a new opportunity for us that we'll be able to apply for next year. There's $15 million in this program for watercraft inspection and decontamination. These funds could be used across the state of Kansas. If we can find state funding, we can essentially double our money with that program and put out a robust program like those successful western states have been doing. And then looking a little farther down the road, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, Kansas looks to possibly get about $21 million from that act. That's not all invasive species, but there's a large invasive species component to that funding. So one of the biggest future challenges for ANS in the state of Kansas is to get these funds here so we can get boots on the ground and manage those populations. And with that, I will take any questions.